Welcome to Kitchen Table Conversations, a series of short and shareable conversation starters for those of us who have or love and support people with a complicated and beautiful brain. Here's your host, Angela Geddes.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Kitchen Table Conversations. If this is the first time that you've tuned in, thank you so much for taking a chance on us. And if you're a repeat listener, thanks again. Thanks, and I hope that you're finding these conversations meaningful, and of course that you bring them back to your own kitchen tables. So again, I'm Angela. I am a social worker, I am a therapist, and I am someone who is deeply committed to helping us all understand what I often refer to as complicated and beautiful brains. And so today I want to kind of bring you with me to something that really stayed with me. I recently attended the 10th International Conference on Adolescents and Adults with FASD in Seattle. And I've been sitting with what I've learned and just trying to figure out how best to share it and what to do with it all, not just as a clinician, but just as a human being, as someone who walks alongside families every single day. So this isn't going to be a formal summary. This is just like a conversation, like the podcast implies, the kind that we would have sitting around with the people that are most important to us. So one of the strongest messages from the conference was that we have to stop starting with behavior and start with the body. And there was a lot of discussion around the gut-brain connection, how something like 90% of our serotonin is actually produced in our guts. And we need to think about that for a moment. We need to think about mood, regulation, stress tolerance, not just in the brain, but in the entire body. And that's what I see every day in my office. It's about people who say, my body, I just can't control it. My brain, I just can't, I need a new one, or I just can't stop. So in this, in these sessions and in much of the conversations, we talked about nutrition. We talked about the importance of sleep. We talked about illnesses and a variety of comorbidities. We talked about sensory overwhelm. And we even talked about long COVID and chronic pain and how all of these can show up as what we label as behavior. So when a child doesn't complete their work, or a teen shuts down, or an adult seems overwhelmed, the question isn't what's wrong with them. It becomes, more effectively, what's happening in their system. So, I've often said, and in some of my books I've quoted, the nervous system is what's driving people and certainly driving the bus sometimes. And so that was another key theme of this conference. And you may have heard of polyvagal theory. I know that Tanya Eckler and their team at Interwoven Connections, formerly known as Adopt for Life, has quite effective programming and treatment options circling around the polyvagal theory. But it circles around the idea that our bodies are constantly scanning for safety or threat. And this happens automatically, and it's called neuroception. And for many individuals with FASD, their nervous system is already wired to be working overtime. So what we might see is fight, flight, freeze, or even fawn responses. And here's the important part. These responses are not choices. They are about survival. So instead of asking, why are they acting like this, we gently shift to, what is their nervous system responding to right now? And that might be their perception of a circumstance or their physiological response, even though the context might be different. So in other words, there may not be a threat, but they're feeling one. And so we still need to create that safe therapeutic response to what their nervous system is telling them and help them to understand more clearly what has really happened and how maybe a combination of their memory, their tendency to ruminate, their tendency to get very stuck on thoughts and ideas, they may not be accurate in this moment. So we need to kind of gently, and curiously find out what's really happening so that we can offer reassurance and yet still validate the experiences because they're very real. Then we talked about schools and, a system that's kind of under pressure. We know that teachers are overwhelmed. We know that the number of IEPs are increasing. And we know that expectations are high all around. Families need their children to be better supported. Schools need to be better supported in order to be able to address those needs. And then there's also that balance between making sure that we're not over-accommodating. And yet, many of the strategies that we've relied on for years are not working. So things like behavior charts, reward systems, consequences, and putative responses, and just expecting people to learn from their mistakes, sometimes become what one presenter called behavioral whack-a-mole. We address one behavior and another one pops up. Why? Because we're not addressing the root, which again sometimes can be physiological. It can be nervous system based. It can be triggers and manifestations from days of feeling discomfort, whether that's sensory overload, physical fatigue, and then of course just the day-to-day, trying to decipher body language and facial cues and just the everyday academic requirements. So what actually can help, what we heard at this conference, is instead let's look at curiosity over compliance, regulation before expectation, and understanding some of these lagging skills that may be subtle and may not be obvious. We might not clearly understand them, but we need to focus on supporting the environment and not just the individual. And some of these strategies can be quite universal, that can make life easier for everybody in the classroom. So I often say connection has to come before correction, and none of us, that's not a shock to any of us, but it was highlighted again, and just, really important for all of us to realize that getting angry and expressing some sort of frustration or discouragement around somebody else's interactions within the classroom, especially if they have FASD, it really rarely ends well. Nobody really likes being corrected, but we have to understand that when our nervous systems are wired differently, sometimes we interpret that as quite a threat. And then when we interpret things as a threat, our bodies start to react to keep us safe and protected. And that might look like an overreaction, but it's something that their body is telling them that they need to do. So this complicates things quite a bit. Another major theme of this conference circled around diagnosis, or maybe lack thereof, or misdiagnosis. We heard about the shift towards a different label, which would be neurodevelopmental disorder attributed to prenatal alcohol exposure. But what really stood out was this. You can have an average IQ, and you can still have significant impairment in everyday functioning. So if we're only looking at IQ, we're missing people, we're missing needs, and we're missing opportunities to support. And circling back to the label, I've often said I will never stop talking about FASD, because when we talk about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, every time we talk about it, we contribute to awareness and hopefully prevention. But also, in our efforts to build a more inclusive service delivery system, my angst around the diagnosis itself and seeking that specific diagnosis means that we're missing people who we cannot get confirmation about actual prenatal alcohol exposure. And in some cases, no matter how compassionately and lovingly we ask the question, sometimes we can't ask the question. Sometimes we can't get an accurate answer. Sometimes we just don't know. And for those individuals, I really, really struggle with focusing so much on this label of FASD, whereas we can still accurately assess brain functioning and learning profiles and things that really matter with day-to-day living, like how is our adaptive living skills? How is our activities of daily living? How can we manage independently? What's our executive functioning like? What is our working memory like? How do we remember how to follow instructions? And what's our reasoning ability? And how can we manage our emotions? Is that on par developmentally? Those things can still be assessed, whether or not we get confirmation of prenatal alcohol exposure. So as much as I want to know about that kind of thing and I want to contribute to prevention initiatives, once the person is in front of me, I really don't care what caused the problem. It's just so important for us as a system to understand that this is brain-based and not behavior and not a result of poor parenting and lack of effort. So, again, if we're only looking at IQ, we're missing people, we're missing the needs, and we're missing opportunities to support. And when we miss it on a regular basis, when people are feeling understood or not heard properly or punished for things that are unclear to them, people experience trauma. They experience shame. They experience mental health struggles, justice system involvement, and, sometimes self-loathing and really being curious about what their purpose is and why they're even here. And that is very sad to me. So this is not because people are trying to do the wrong thing. It's because we didn't understand what people need. This conference also really focused on living experience, which, many of us believe that this is the most important voice that we can really listen to. And some really powerful moments in the conference circled around that. We heard from individuals describing what it feels like when he becomes overwhelmed. And he said, it starts small and then my brain just goes offline. Everything inside me needs to get out. And afterwards, the thinking comes back and the guilt comes in. So wow, that right there, that's the moment we often miss. We step in after the behavior, but what people are asking for is help me before I get there. Please stay calm. Please stay close. Please don't give up on me. And please help me regulate. Help me de-escalate. Then we talked about mental health supports that are actually, looking like they're starting to fit. There's not very much evidence in the way of treatment modalities, but there has been some recent research focusing on adapted dialectical behavioral therapy, which is DBT. And when it's modified for neurodiverse individuals and when caregivers are involved, it really seems to be working. So skills like emotional regulation, distress tolerance, mindfulness, and interpersonal effectiveness are improving. But here's the key. It's not just about teaching skills. It's about teaching them in a way that makes sense for the brain that we're supporting. And for those of you who have been following me, and for those of you who have attended some of my sessions, you know that my work circles around acceptance commitment therapy. And although there's no formal research, I can tell you practice-based evidence clearly indicates that people are doing better when they're able to reconnect with their values and detach from some of the unnecessary or unhelpful thoughts, aka ruminating, and when they can really stop judging themselves so harshly on quote unquote behaviors and instead see them as symptoms and not an indication of character. Those things are really, really critical. And so, that's what I'm finding to be really, really helpful, but I'm anxious to get more information on the DBT and see whether we can, incorporate some of those findings as well. So when we talk about adulthood, independence, and rethinking our support, we also heard more stories from adulthood. And one that really stuck with me was about a young man who moved to his first apartment. He was excited. He was happy. He knew he was ready. But within a very short time, things fell apart. The rent wasn't paid on time. Garbage piled up. He was evicted. And people said he just needs to be more responsible. But here's the truth. He needed more direct and indirect support. He needed a different approach. It wasn't his fault that things fell apart. We have to keep the expectations within reach. So, independence without support is not independence. Sometimes it can be a risk, and we need to focus more on interdependence and having those kind of lifelong connections and building a circle of support. And so then we talked about this, this FASD thing being a very global issue, and it's bigger than all of us. The conference brought together voices from all over the world: Canada, Ireland, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, Australia. And the message was clear. This is not a small issue. This is a public health issue. In some areas, prevalence rates are as high as 7%. And yet, so many people remain undiagnosed and unsupported, and pregnancies continue to be impacted by alcohol, because we're not getting the message across in a way that people want to hear it. So we need to shift that. And so what do we do with all this information? If you're a parent, if you're a caregiver, if you're a teacher, a professional, I don't want this to feel overwhelming. I want it to feel grounding and hopeful. The message is not about doing more. It's about doing things differently and about creating environments that are helpful for all of us, and really hoping to help people see things differently, see behavior as a way of communication, see the nervous system before the action, see strengths alongside struggles, and see the need for support, not punishment. So one of the most meaningful takeaways for me was the idea that understanding the condition is not the same as understanding the moment and the symptoms that we're seeing in front of us. And I see that for individuals too. They can say, yes, I have FASD, but do they really understand the implications on day to day? And that's where the real work happens, in the moment, in the pause, in the way that we respond. So thank you so much for sitting in with me today, for being curious, for being open and lasting this long. This is a bit longer, I think, of a podcast than what I normally do, but there was a lot to take in Seattle. I'm so grateful for my experiences. I didn't mention that I presented 2 workshops, one of them with Anna Webster, from Manchester in the UK, and we talked about seeing the unseen and how important it is to train social workers and allied health professionals to be better able to screen, assess, identify, and support individuals, and look beyond trauma, look beyond behavior, look beyond typical parenting strategies, and be more inclusive and more targeted in our approaches. Focusing on brains and the brain-based behaviors and symptoms. And then I was able to present with Kay Hamilton-Smith, who is a social worker, a businesswoman, and a caregiver herself. And we talked about not your typical growing up and adulting guide, and ways that we can be supportive of individuals with FASD and other brain-based conditions. So not my books and the talk was not focused specifically on FASD, but was going to be helpful with addressing the symptoms of FASD, as well as other conditions like ADHD, complex mental health, autism spectrum disorder, bipolar, et cetera, et cetera. So honored to be both a recipient of such valuable information and to contribute to the learning for many. So once again, thank you for tuning in, and I hope that you're able to bring this home to your kitchen tables. With many thanks, Angela.